I fainted in the middle of a county zoning hearing, right after I raised my hand to speak. The paramedic kept asking me if I had family nearby while cutting my jacket off, and I remember noticing that one of my shoes was still neatly under the chair. At the hospital, they said my son's phone went straight to voicemail. They tried again and again. By the third day, I understood something I had never allowed myself to consider. The silence was intentional, and my life was already being rearranged without me. I fainted in the middle of a county zoning hearing, right after I raised my hand to speak. One moment I was standing behind the podium, adjusting my glasses and waiting for the chairwoman to acknowledge me, and the next the room tilted sideways. The ceiling lights blurred into long white streaks, and someone shouted my name as if from the end of a tunnel. I remember thinking, very clearly, that I had forgotten to lock my car. I came back to awareness on the floor, staring at the underside of a folding table. My cheek was pressed against the cold tile, and my left arm felt heavy, useless. A man in a navy blazer knelt beside me, his face pale, his voice too loud. "Don't move, ma'am. Help is coming." I tried to tell him I was fine, that this was embarrassing, that I had just stood up too fast. The words wouldn't form. My tongue felt thick, and my chest burned in a deep, unfamiliar way. The paramedics arrived quickly. They moved with practiced calm, cutting my jacket open, sliding sticky pads onto my skin. One of them asked my age. Another asked if I had any medical conditions. A third leaned close and asked if I had family nearby. I remember noticing that one of my shoes was still neatly tucked under the chair where I had been sitting, as if I might need it later. The siren wailed as they loaded me into the ambulance. The doors slammed shut, sealing me inside with the sharp smell of antiseptic and rubber. A young paramedic sat across from me, holding an oxygen mask to my face. "Stay with me," he said. "What's your name?" I told him. "Do you have a next of kin?" I gave him my son's name and number from memory, because I dialed it so many times over the years it was etched into my mind. At the hospital, everything moved fast and slow at the same time. Bright lights overhead, wheels rattling beneath the gurney, voices calling out measurements and instructions. A doctor appeared at my side, his expression serious but controlled. "You had a significant cardiac event," he said. "We need to run tests immediately." I asked him to call my son. He nodded and passed the instruction to a nurse without hesitation. They took my phone and placed it in a clear plastic bag. I watched as a nurse scrolled through my contacts and tapped my son's name. She put the phone to her ear, waited, then frowned slightly. "Straight to voicemail," she said, more to herself than to me. "We'll try again." They wheeled me into a curtained bay, attached more wires, started an IV. The pain in my chest grew sharper, radiating into my jaw and down my arm. I clenched my teeth and focused on breathing. Somewhere beyond the curtain, I heard the nurse again. "Still no answer," she said. "I'll keep calling." Time lost its meaning after that. I drifted in and out, catching fragments of conversation. "We've left messages. Emergency contact. We'll document every attempt." At one point, a woman's voice cut through the haze, firm and familiar. "I'm here with her," she said. "I'll stay." It took me a moment to recognize her. Lila, my former assistant from the planning department. She stood at my bedside, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes steady despite the worry I could see there. "They can't reach your son," she told me quietly, leaning close so only I could hear. "I've tried too." I wanted to tell her there must be a mistake, that he was probably in a meeting or driving. My son was always busy. He had a demanding job, a family, responsibilities. I had spent years reminding myself of that whenever he missed a call or postponed a visit. The words stayed stuck in my throat. The doctor returned with test results. "We're admitting you to the cardiac unit," he said. "You're stable for now, but we need to monitor you closely." He asked again about my family. Lila answered for me. "She lives alone," she said. "I'll handle whatever paperwork you need." The doctor nodded, grateful for any certainty in the chaos. That first night passed in a blur of beeping monitors and shallow sleep. Each time I woke, I checked the clock and wondered if my phone had rung. It hadn't. A nurse came in around midnight to adjust my medication. "Any luck reaching your son?" I asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "We've left several messages," she said gently. "We'll keep trying." By the second day, the initial shock had worn off, replaced by a dull, aching awareness of my own body. My chest felt bruised, my head throbbed, and my mouth tasted like metal. Lila sat in the chair by my bed, answering emails on her laptop when she wasn't watching the door. She'd taken time off work without hesitation. "You'd do the same for me," she said when I tried to protest. I wasn't sure that was true, but I was grateful all the same. The doctor explained the test results in careful terms. There had been damage, but it was manageable. With medication and rest, I would recover. "We've been trying to reach your emergency contact," he added, glancing at my chart. "No response yet." He said it as a statement of fact, not judgment. Still, the words landed heavily. On the afternoon of the second day, a social worker stopped by. She introduced herself and asked about my support system at home. I told her about my son, about his wife, about my grandchildren. Saying the words out loud made the room feel emptier. "We've documented multiple attempts to reach him," she said. 42 so far." She paused. "We'll continue." I nodded, staring at the white wall behind her. 42 was a strange number, too large to be accidental, too specific to ignore. I tried to push the thought away. My son loved me. He had always loved me, in his own way. He would call when he saw the messages. He would be horrified that he hadn't answered sooner. That night, I dreamed of my old office at City Hall. Papers stacked neatly on my desk, my name still on the door. In the dream, I was packing up my things, even though I hadn't planned to retire yet. People walked past without looking in, carrying boxes, moving on. When I woke, my heart was racing, and the monitor beside my bed chirped in response. On the morning of the third day, a nurse brought me a cup of water and helped me sit up. "Good news," she said. "Your vitals look stable." She checked my chart, then met my eyes. "We've called your son 47 times," she said quietly. "Left messages each time." She didn't add anything else. She didn't need to. Lila stood by the window, her arms crossed. She hadn't slept much. I could see it in the shadows under her eyes. "I checked," she said, turning back toward me. "He's been active. Professionally, I mean." She stopped herself, as if unsure how much to say. "There are records. Public ones." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the information settle. I thought about all the times I had waited to call him back, not wanting to interrupt. All the times I had said, "He's busy," to friends who asked why he wasn't around. Lying there, listening to the steady beep of the monitor, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, clearer. By the end of the third day, I understood that the silence was not a mistake. It was a choice. And whatever I thought I knew about my place in my son's life, whatever assumptions I had built my world around, were already starting to crumble. When I finally slept through the night without waking to the sound of my own breathing amplified by machines, it was already the fourth morning. The room was quiet in that particular hospital way. Not silent, but muted, as if everything important was happening somewhere else. The blinds were half open, letting in a pale strip of winter light that fell across the foot of the bed. I watched dust move slowly through it, and tried to remember the last time I had felt this tired without having done anything at all. A nurse named Karen came in just after 7. She was older than most of the staff, calm in a way that came from years of doing the same work and seeing the same fear in different faces. She checked my blood pressure, adjusted the IV, and smiled at me like we already knew each other. "You're doing well," she said. "Dr. Hayes will be in later this morning." "I know," I nodded. My voice still felt unreliable, so I used it sparingly. Karen hesitated before leaving, her hand resting on the doorframe. "Your friend stepped out to grab some breakfast," she said. She's been here every morning before I start my shift. Friend. The word landed softly but stayed. Lila had been here when no one else was. She'd learned the rhythm of the machines, knew when the nurses came, when the doctors made rounds. She reminded me to drink water, asked questions I didn't think to ask, took notes on her phone without being asked. She never once mentioned my son unless I did. After Karen left, I stared at the phone on the tray table. It had been returned to me the night before, fully charged, notifications neatly cleared, 47 missed calls from the hospital, 5 voicemails. I didn't open them. I didn't need to hear the messages to know what they said. There were no missed calls from my son. When Lila came back, she set a paper cup of coffee on the windowsill and took her seat without ceremony. She glanced at my face, then at the phone. "You don't have to look at it yet," she said. "I know," I replied. My voice sounded steadier than it felt. We sat like that for a while. Outside the window, a man in a maintenance uniform pushed a cart slowly across the parking lot. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor alarmed and was quickly silenced. "Do you remember Mark Jensen?" Lila asked suddenly. I frowned, searching my memory. "The zoning attorney?" "Yes. He was asking about you yesterday." I turned my head toward her. "Why?" She chose her words carefully. "He said your name came up in a professional context. He assumed you'd be reachable." I felt a faint pressure behind my eyes. "Did he say how?" Lila shook her head. "Not directly. Just that he was surprised no one could get through to you. I was an advocate." That was the first time it occurred to me that my absence wasn't just personal. I had spent 32 years working for the city. I knew how systems moved, how decisions were made quietly, without waiting for anyone who wasn't present. Being unreachable didn't just mean being ignored. It meant being replaced. Dr. Hayes arrived mid-morning with a resident trailing behind him. He explained my test results again, more thoroughly this time, pointing to charts and numbers that meant little to me. My heart would recover. I would need medication, follow-ups, lifestyle changes, nothing I hadn't helped plan for other people countless times in my career. "Do you have someone at home with you?" he asked. "I live alone," I said. He nodded. "Already writing." "We'll arrange some short-term support. A visiting nurse, at least for the first few weeks." My son," I started, then stopped. "He lives out of state." The doctor glanced up, then back down at the chart. "We'll note that." After he left, a woman from case management came in with a clipboard. She asked about stairs in my home, about pets, about who would drive me to follow-up appointments. I answered everything honestly. When she asked about family involvement, I hesitated just long enough for her to notice. "We've made multiple attempts to contact your listed emergency contact," she said gently. "We'll keep that open." I thanked her. The conversation left me feeling strangely exposed, as if my life had been reduced to a checklist someone else was filling out. That afternoon, Lila stepped out to take a call. When she came back, her expression had changed, tighter, more controlled. "I don't want to upset you," she said, standing by the bed instead of sitting. "But I think you should know something." I waited. "There was a planning commission meeting yesterday," she continued. "Your name came up, not in a casual way." My stomach tightened. "Go on." "There was a proposal to move forward without your review. Expedite approval. Someone said you'd been unreachable and that it was time to stop delaying things." "And who said that?" I asked. She met my eyes. "Your son." The room felt suddenly smaller. I imagined him sitting at a conference table, confident, articulate, saying my name as if it were an inconvenience. I had known he attended meetings like that sometimes, advising clients, positioning himself as indispensable. I hadn't known he would speak for me. "He didn't mention the hospital?" I asked. "No." I looked at the ceiling, tracing a crack in the paint I hadn't noticed before. It ran diagonally, faint but unmistakable. "He told them you'd been difficult to reach for months," Lila added. "That it was becoming an issue. For months." I thought about our last phone call, 3 weeks earlier. He'd sounded rushed, distracted. I had cut the conversation short so he could get back to work. I had told myself I was being considerate. That evening, after Lila left to get some sleep, I listened to the voicemails from the hospital, calm voices, increasingly urgent, dates and times, requests for a callback. The last one was shorter than the others. Please contact us immediately. I didn't cry. I didn't feel dramatic. I felt oddly detached, like I was finally seeing a document I'd signed years ago without reading closely. The next morning, I was cleared to move out of the cardiac unit to a step-down floor. As they wheeled my bed down the hallway, I caught sight of my reflection in a glass door. I looked older than I remembered, thinner, smaller, but my eyes were sharp, more alert than they had been in a long time. In the new room, there was a single chair and a small table. Lila set my bag down and sat without being asked. He still hasn't called, she said quietly. I know, I replied. She studied me for a moment. Do you want me to say something to Mark or anyone? No, I said. Not yet. That afternoon, a package arrived at the nurse's station addressed to me. Lila brought it in, frowning. I didn't order anything, I said. The return address was a law firm I recognized. My son's firm. Inside was a folder. Clean. Professional. Tucked inside were printed emails, meeting notes, and a draft document with my name typed neatly at the top. Authorization for interim decision-making authority. My position listed as currently unavailable. The date on the draft was 2 days before I collapsed. I closed the folder slowly, my hands steady. Lila watched me, her face pale. That's not, she started. I know, I said. In that moment, lying in a hospital bed with a healing heart and a clear mind, I understood something with absolute certainty. My son hadn't failed to show up because he couldn't. He hadn't missed my emergency because he didn't know. He had already decided I was in the way. I didn't say anything right away. I closed the folder and set it on the bedside table, aligning it carefully with the edge as if order might help me think. Lila sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for me to tell her what this meant. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the air vent and the distant rattle of a cart in the hallway. They sent this to my house, I said finally. Not here. Lila nodded, which means it was already on its way. Yes. Well. I picked the folder up again and opened it, this time more slowly. The draft authorization was written in clean, neutral language. No accusations, no urgency, just efficiency. It outlined a temporary transfer of decision-making authority related to municipal planning matters, citing my ongoing unavailability and the need to avoid delays. My son's name appeared multiple times, always in a professional context, never as family. There was no mention of illness, no concern, just absence. At the back of the folder was a printed calendar. My calendar. Meetings I had scheduled weeks in advance, now neatly reassigned. My name crossed out, replaced with his. I recognized the formatting. He had access to my work systems. I had given it to him years ago, when he first started advising on city contracts. Just in case, he'd said. For emergencies. I closed my eyes and let out a slow breath. Lila leaned forward. Do you want me to call someone? She asked. A lawyer? HR? No, I said. Not yet. She hesitated. Are you sure? I need to understand the full picture, I replied. Before I do anything. That afternoon, after Lila left to take care of her own responsibilities, I asked a nurse for my tablet. I hadn't used it since arriving. It had been sitting in my bag, untouched. When I powered it on, notifications flooded the screen. Emails, calendar alerts, meeting reminders that had already passed. I opened my email first. There were messages from colleagues, polite but pointed. Hope you're well. We needed to move forward. Please advise when you're available again. And then, threaded beneath them, replies from my son. Confident, reassuring, written as if he spoke for me. She's aware. She agrees this is the best course. She asked me to handle it. I stared at the words, feeling something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart. He hadn't just stepped in, he had replaced me. I clicked through to the city's public meeting archive. It took me less than a minute to find what I was looking for. The zoning hearing from the day after my collapse. There he was, seated at the long table, suit perfectly pressed, speaking into the microphone with practiced ease. The timestamp confirmed it. Same day, same hour, I was being moved into the cardiac unit. I watched the recording without sound at first. His gestures were familiar, confident, persuasive. When I turned the volume on, I heard my name spoken again, casually, as if it were a minor administrative detail. "She's unavailable at the moment," he said. "But we can't afford to stall progress." No mention of the hospital, no acknowledgement of what unavailable meant. I shut the tablet off and leaned back against the pillows. For years, I had told myself that my son's ambition was something to be proud of, that his confidence was earned, that stepping aside occasionally was part of being supportive. I had believed that love meant not standing in his way. Now, lying in a hospital bed, I saw how easily that belief had been used against me. When Lila returned the next morning, I told her what I'd found. She listened without interrupting, her expression darkening with each detail. "He didn't even pause," she said when I finished. "Not once." "No," I agreed. "He didn't." She shook her head. "That's not panic, that's planning." End quote. The words settled heavily between us. Later that day, a nurse came in with discharge paperwork. "You'll likely go home tomorrow," she said. "Do you have someone to stay with you?" I thought about my house. Quiet, familiar. The place where I had sorted through zoning maps at the kitchen table, where I had taken late calls and early meetings, where I had always assumed I was still needed. "I'll manage," I said. That evening, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. My son's name. For a moment, I considered not answering, letting it go to voicemail the way he had done to me, but something steadied inside me. I pressed accept. "Mom," he said, his voice quick, controlled. "I just heard. Are you okay?" I pictured him standing in his office, door closed, phone to his ear, already managing the conversation. I pictured the meeting table, the microphone, my crossed-out name. "I'm stable," I said. "I've been in the hospital for 4 days." There was a pause. Not surprise. Calculation. "I didn't know it was that serious," he said. "I've been slammed. You know how it is." "Yes," I replied. "I do." He continued talking, explaining, justifying. He mentioned deadlines, pressure, responsibility. He said he'd been meaning to call, that things had gotten away from him. "I saw the documents you sent to my house," I said calmly. Another pause, longer this time. "Oh," he said. That was just precautionary. You weren't answering emails. People were asking questions." "I was unconscious," I said. He exhaled, as if inconvenienced. "Mom, don't make this dramatic. I was handling things. That's what you taught me to do." I closed my eyes briefly. "You spoke for me in a public meeting." "I had to," he said. "We couldn't wait." "Did you tell them where I was?" I asked. Silence. "I'll be home tomorrow," I said. "We'll talk then." There was a beat, then relief crept into his voice. "Good. We should. There are some things we need to sort out." After I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. That night, I didn't sleep much. I replayed moments I had brushed aside over the years. Conversations cut short, decisions made without me, invitations phrased as updates rather than questions. I saw them now not as isolated incidents, but as steps in a process I had unknowingly cooperated with. By morning, I knew something fundamental had changed. When the nurse came to discharge me, I thanked her and gathered my things. Lila arrived to drive me home. As we walked toward the exit, she glanced at me. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I paused by the glass doors, sunlight spilling across the floor. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Busy, unapologetic. "I'm going to listen," I said, and then I'm going to decide if it's muck. Because whatever story I had been telling myself about my role, my power, my place in my son's life, was no longer true, and the truth, once seen, could not be put back. The first night back in my house felt unfamiliar in a way I hadn't expected. Nothing had changed. The furniture was where it had always been. The clock in the kitchen still ticked too loudly. The porch light came on automatically at dusk. But something in me had shifted, and the space seemed to know it. Lila helped me inside, set my bag down, and made sure I had water, my medication, and the discharge instructions neatly placed on the counter. She hovered longer than she needed to. "I can stay," she offered. "At least tonight." I shook my head. "I need to be alone." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Call me if you need anything." Anything. After she left, the door clicked shut with a finality that echoed through the house. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to the quiet. This was the same quiet I had lived with for years, but it felt different now. Less like peace, more like evidence. I moved slowly through the rooms, careful with my chest, my hand brushing the backs of chairs, the edge of the counter. In the living room, I noticed a stack of mail on the side table. Most of it was unopened. I hadn't been home to collect it. I hadn't even thought about it. I sat down and went through it methodically. Utility bills, a grocery flyer, a magazine I barely read anymore. Then a thick envelope from the city clerk's office. Inside was a courtesy copy of an agenda amendment. My name appeared once, crossed out with a thin line. Beneath it, my son's name had been typed in. I didn't feel surprised. I felt confirmed. I thought back to the first time I had stepped aside for him professionally. It had been years ago, shortly after he'd joined his firm. He'd asked if he could sit in on a meeting, just to observe. I'd agreed, proud that he was interested in my work. When a question came up, he'd answered it smoothly, confidently. The room had nodded along. Afterward, I'd told myself it was good mentorship, good parenting. Over time, observation became participation. Participation became substitution, and I had let it happen, one small concession at a time, because it felt easier than pushing back, because I wanted him to succeed, because I didn't want to seem threatened by my own child. I moved into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, then stood there, staring at the sink as memory after memory surfaced. The planning retreat I hadn't been invited to because it was more efficient this way. The draft report sent for my review after decisions had already been made. The emails that began with, "just looping you in." I had told myself it was normal, that this was how transitions happened, that I was lucky to have a son so capable, so involved. What I hadn't allowed myself to consider was whether I had been given a choice. I slept poorly that night, waking often, my chest tight, not from pain but from realization. By morning, I was exhausted in a deeper way than the hospital had left me. Still, I showered, dressed carefully, and made myself breakfast, toast, eggs, familiar routines, performed deliberately. My son arrived just after 10. I heard his car before the doorbell rang, a newer model than the last time I'd seen it. I watched through the window as he straightened his jacket, checked his phone, then rang the bell with practiced confidence. When I opened the door, he leaned in to hug me. I let him, feeling the stiffness of his posture, the way his arms didn't quite settle. "You look better than I expected," he said, stepping back. "Hospitals always exaggerate." I gestured for him to come in. He moved through the house as if it belonged to him, glancing around, taking in details. He sat at the kitchen table without asking. "So," he said, clasping his hands together, "we need to talk about next steps." I took a seat across from him. "We do." He launched into it immediately. Timelines, meetings, damage control. He spoke as if my absence had been an inconvenience to manage, not a crisis to respond to. He mentioned the calls he'd missed only once, briefly, as if acknowledging a clerical error. "I assumed if it was really urgent, someone would text," he said, "or call my office." "They did," I replied. repeatedly. He waved a hand. Look, I'm here now. That's what matters. I studied his face. The confidence, the impatience, the subtle irritation that flickered when I didn't immediately agree. I watched the zoning hearing, I said. He froze, just for a moment. You did? Yes. He recovered quickly. Then you saw how smoothly it went. We avoided delays. That was important. You spoke for me, I said. You reassigned my responsibilities. You sent documents to my house. He leaned back in his chair. You weren't available. I stepped in. That's what families do. Families. The word sounded strange coming from him. I thought about another moment, years earlier, that I had rarely revisited, the day my husband died. A sudden stroke. No warning. I had called my son that morning, my voice shaking. He had arrived late, distracted, took a call in the hallway while the doctor spoke to me. I had told myself he was in shock, that people grieved differently. At the funeral, he had stood beside me, composed, already talking about logistics, paperwork, timelines. He had taken charge then, too. I had been grateful. I had been numb. Now, sitting across from him at my kitchen table, I wondered if that had been the first time I had mistaken control for care. I didn't ask you to step in, I said quietly. You didn't have to, he replied. You raised me to recognize when action is needed. I realized then that he genuinely believed that in his mind, he wasn't betraying me. He was succeeding me. The conversation ended without resolution. He left with promises to circle back, to keep me updated. He hugged me again at the door, tighter this time, as if asserting something unspoken. After he left, I sat alone at the table, my untouched coffee cold. The house was silent again, but this time the silence felt clarifying. This hadn't started with my collapse. It hadn't started with missed calls or documents in the mail. It had started years ago, with small decisions I had justified in the name of love, support, and pride. I had been so focused on being a good mother that I had stopped being a person with authority of my own. And now, with my health fragile and my position already being reassigned, I understood the truth I had been avoiding. I hadn't been pushed aside suddenly. I had been eased out carefully, deliberately, while I told myself it was kindness. That realization settled heavily but cleanly, and for the first time since I fainted on that cold tile floor, I felt something other than confusion or hurt. I felt resolve. Lila came by the next afternoon with groceries I hadn't asked for, and a stack of folders tucked under her arm. She set everything on the kitchen counter, moving with the ease of someone who had been in this space many times before. She didn't comment on the mail spread across the table or the untouched coffee mug from the morning. She simply filled the kettle and turned it on. I figured you might not feel like driving yet, she said. That's fair, I replied. She glanced at me, assessing. How did it go with him? I considered the question. Exactly how you'd expect. She nodded once, as if that confirmed something she already knew. When the kettle whistled, she poured the water and sat across from me, folding her hands around the mug. I brought something, she said, sliding the folders toward me. Only if you want to see it. What is it? Context. I opened the first folder. Inside were copies of public records, meeting minutes, filings, emails obtained through routine requests. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden, just patterns laid out clearly, without emotion. My son's name appeared often, always adjacent to mine, sometimes replacing it, sometimes speaking for it. He's been positioning himself for a while, Lila said gently. I didn't notice at first either. It looked collaborative, mentorship, legacy. And now? I asked. Now it looks like succession, she said. The word sat between us. Succession. Planned. Anticipated. I closed the folder. Why are you doing this? I asked her. You don't owe me anything. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around the kitchen, her eyes lingering on the framed photo by the window. My husband and me, taken years ago at a city awards dinner. We looked younger, proud. You probably don't remember this, she said finally, but when I first started working for the department, I was barely keeping my head above water. I was new, overwhelmed, and everyone else seemed to have it figured out. I waited. You stayed late one night, she continued. You noticed I was still there and asked why. I told you I was afraid of making a mistake. You said, everyone does. The difference is whether someone teaches you how to fix it. I smiled faintly. That sounds like something I'd say. You didn't just say it, she replied. You stayed. You walked me through it. You didn't take credit. You didn't rush. You treated me like I mattered. Her voice steadied. You changed how I saw myself at work. I've never forgotten that. I felt a tightening in my throat, unexpected and unwelcome. I looked down at my hands, resting on the table. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, I said. That's okay, she replied. You don't have to decide today. I just didn't want you making decisions without knowing what's already been set in motion. Over the next few days, Lila checked in regularly. Sometimes she brought food. Sometimes she just sat with me while I rested. She never pushed. She never filled the silence unnecessarily. Her presence was steady, unassuming. In contrast, my son's calls became more frequent. Short, transactional. He asked about my recovery, then quickly shifted to updates, approvals, things that needed my input. Each time, I felt the same quiet discomfort, the sense that the concern was performative, the agenda already decided. One afternoon, while sorting through old files in my study, I came across a notebook I hadn't opened in years. It was filled with handwritten notes from early in my career, observations, questions, reminders to myself about why certain decisions mattered. At the front, in my own handwriting, were words I had once taken seriously. Authority without presence is just permission to be ignored. I sat back in the chair, the leather creaking softly, and let the memory surface. Years ago, when my son was in college, he had come home frustrated after a disagreement with a professor. He doesn't respect me, he'd said. He doesn't listen. What makes you think he should? I had asked. He'd looked at me, surprised. I had explained that respect wasn't automatic, that it came from clarity, boundaries, and consistency. I had told him that if he wanted to be taken seriously, he had to show up as someone who meant what they said. Now, I wondered what lesson he had taken from that conversation. That evening, Lila and I sat on the porch as the sun went down. The neighborhood was quiet, the air cool. She sipped her tea and stared out at the street. You know, she said, there's a difference between helping someone and replacing them. Yes, I said. I know. You taught me that, she added. I closed my eyes briefly. The weight of the realization pressed down on me, but it wasn't crushing, it was grounding. For years, I had told myself that being indispensable was selfish, that stepping aside was generous, that making room for others was the mark of good leadership and good motherhood. What I hadn't considered was that generosity without boundaries becomes erasure. By the end of that week, my strength had improved. I could move around the house more easily, take short walks down the block. Each step felt deliberate, purposeful. I wasn't rushing anymore, I was paying attention. One morning, as I returned from a walk, I found my son's car parked in the driveway again. He stood by the door, phone in hand, already mid-thought when I approached. I need you to sign something, he said, holding up a folder. Just a formality. It keeps things moving while you recover. I didn't take it from him. I looked at the folder, then at his face. Did you bring this before asking how I'm feeling? I asked. He frowned. Mom, don't do this. Do what? Make it personal. It's I smiled, not unkindly. It's always been personal. He sighed, exasperated. You're overthinking this. I'm trying to help. I stepped past him into the house. No, I said calmly. You're trying to proceed. He followed me inside, irritated. What's the difference? I turned to face him. Help waits. Proceeding assumes consent. He stared at me, clearly not used to this version of the conversation. "I'm not signing anything today," I said, "or tomorrow." His jaw tightened. "This isn't wise. Neither is pretending nothing has changed," I replied. After he left, the house felt quieter than before, but not empty. Lila arrived later that afternoon, and I told her what had happened. She nodded. "That was the first boundary," she said. "Yes," I agreed, "and it won't be the last." As the evening settled in, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't afraid of losing my son's approval. I was afraid of losing myself again. And this time, I wasn't willing to make that trade. The shift from confusion to clarity didn't happen all at once. It came in small moments, each one unsettling on its own, but together forming a picture I could no longer ignore. Part of me wanted to believe I had overreacted, that illness had sharpened my fears and made ordinary events feel threatening. But the signs kept appearing, quietly, persistently. 3 days after I refused to sign the folder my son brought, I received a call from a woman named Denise who worked in the city clerk's office. We had known each other for years, not as friends exactly, but as people who trusted each other's competence. "I wasn't sure if I should call," she said cautiously, but something felt off. I sat down at the kitchen table. "Tell me," she took a breath. "Your son came by last week. He asked about access procedures. Specifically, how temporary authority is documented if an official is incapacitated." The word landed heavily. "I told him we'd need formal documentation," she continued. "Medical confirmation, consent, the usual safeguards." He seemed disappointed. I closed my eyes for a moment. "Did he mention me?" "Only indirectly," she said. "He framed it as concern, said he wanted to make sure things ran smoothly if you needed an extended recovery." End quote. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the grain of the wood. Concern, recovery, smooth transitions, all words I had used myself in the past, always with care. Hearing them now, repurposed, made my stomach tighten. That afternoon, Lila came by with her laptop. She didn't say anything at first, just set it on the table and opened a file. "I did a little more digging," she said. "Public records only, nothing improper." "What did you find?" I asked. She turned the screen toward me. It showed a timeline, dates, meetings, filings, each one aligned with moments I had been distracted, tired, or absent. The pattern was unmistakable. Whenever I stepped back, even briefly, my son stepped forward, not to cover for me, but to claim space. "He's been laying groundwork," she said quietly. "Not just professionally, financially, too." I felt a chill. "How?" She clicked to the next page. Property tax inquiries, trust consultations, requests for documentation related to my house. All routed through intermediaries, all framed as routine planning. "He hasn't done anything illegal," she said. "But he's been preparing." "For what?" I asked, though I already knew. "For the possibility that you wouldn't be able to push back." That night, I barely slept. Memories surfaced uninvited. The time he'd suggested I simplify my finances to reduce stress. The casual way he'd asked where I kept important documents. The offhand comment about how difficult it must be to manage everything alone. I had laughed then, brushed it aside, told myself he was being thoughtful. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped through the mail slot. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a pamphlet from a private management firm that specialized in transition planning for senior officials. The language was smooth, reassuring, supportive services, streamlined oversight, protection from burnout. A note had been paperclipped to the front, just 3 words, written in my son's handwriting. "For when you're ready." I didn't tear it up. I didn't throw it away. I placed it on the counter and looked at it until the meaning settled fully in my chest. This wasn't about helping me recover. This was about preparing for my removal. When Lila arrived later, she saw the pamphlet immediately. Her expression tightened. "That's new," she said. "Yes," I replied, "and it explains a lot. This crowd, We sat together, the afternoon light slanting through the window. Outside, a neighbor mowed his lawn. Ordinary life continued, oblivious to the quiet reckoning happening inside my kitchen. "I think he believes he's doing the right thing," I said slowly. "Not morally, strategically." Lila nodded. "That can be the most dangerous kind of certainty." I thought of all the times I had been certain of my own intentions as a mother, certain that stepping back was loving, certain that trust would be returned in kind. I had been wrong about that. Later that day, I received another call, this one from a man I hadn't spoken to in years, Thomas Reed, a retired consultant who had served on several advisory boards with me. "I heard you'd been unwell," he said. "I'm glad you're on your feet." "Thank you," I replied. He hesitated. "I wanted to ask you something, and I hope you don't take this the wrong way." "Go on." "Your son reached out to me, asked about your decision-making process, whether you'd ever expressed doubts about continuing in your role." I felt my pulse quicken, but my voice stayed even. "And what did you tell him?" "That you were one of the most deliberate people I've ever worked with," he said. "That you didn't make decisions lightly or under pressure." He didn't seem pleased. After the call ended, I stood up and walked slowly to the window. The street looked the same as it always had: trees, sidewalks, familiar houses. Yet everything felt exposed, as if a curtain had been pulled back on a stage I hadn't realized I was standing on. By the end of the week, the warnings had accumulated into something undeniable. My son wasn't reacting to my illness. He was using it. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with a strange, steady calm. Because once I saw the pattern, I understood something else just as clearly. He believed I was weakened. He believed my authority depended on my physical strength, my constant presence, my willingness to engage. He believed that if I slowed down, I would disappear. What he didn't understand was that authority doesn't vanish when you stop moving. It concentrates. That night, I sat at my desk and opened a new notebook. On the first page, I wrote one sentence: "I will decide what happens next." I didn't yet know how or when, but I knew this much. Whatever move my son thought he was making, he was several steps behind. And for the first time since my collapse, I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. The evidence did not arrive all at once. It came in layers, each one peeling back another assumption I had lived with for years. I had thought I understood my son's ambition. I had believed I knew the limits of it. What I was discovering now was not recklessness or panic, but calculation. 2 mornings after I began the notebook, I received an email from my bank. It was routine in tone, polite and professional, but it caught my attention immediately. The subject line read, "Request for verification." Inside, a representative explained that someone had inquired about adding an additional authorized contact to my accounts. No changes had been made, they assured me. They simply needed confirmation before proceeding. I knew, without asking, who had made the request. I called the bank directly. After verifying my identity, the representative hesitated before continuing. "It appears your son requested the forms," she said carefully. "He indicated it was precautionary, given your recent health event." "And did he provide documentation?" I asked. "No," she replied, "which is why we reached out to you." I thanked her and ended the call, my hands steady on the phone. I didn't feel shock anymore, just a tightening certainty. When Lila arrived later that day, I told her about the call. She didn't look surprised. "That's consistent," she said. "He's been probing multiple access points, not forcing anything, just testing where resistance appears." "For now," I said. That evening, I went back to the folder he had brought to my house days earlier, the one I had refused to sign. I hadn't examined it closely then. I opened it now, page by page. What struck me wasn't what was included, but what was missing. There was no mention of my wishes, no contingency that involved my input. Every clause assumed a vacuum, an absence, a need for someone else to step in. I reached the final page and froze. Attached, almost as an afterthought, was a summary memo. not addressed to me, but to an internal review committee. My name appeared in the third person. Subject has demonstrated increasing difficulty maintaining consistent availability. Consider transitional oversight to ensure continuity. The language was careful, neutral, damning in its understatement. I sat back in the chair, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. This wasn't concern. It was narrative building. I thought back to the conversations with Geneva, with Thomas, with Denise. The same questions, the same framing. Had I seemed forgetful, overwhelmed, unreliable? It was never about whether I was capable. It was about whether others could be convinced I wasn't. The next piece came from a place I hadn't expected. On Thursday afternoon, I received a call from my former supervisor, Harold Price. He was well into his 70s now, retired, sharp as ever. "I hear you gave everyone a scare," he said. "I did," I replied. There was a pause. "Your son reached out to me," he continued, asked if I'd noticed any decline. I closed my eyes briefly. "And I told him the truth," Harold said, "that you were more methodical than anyone I'd ever worked with, that if you stepped back, it was intentional." He didn't like that answer. After the call, I sat alone in the study, surrounded by shelves of binders and books I had collected over decades. This room had been my command center. Every major decision I had made started here. And somewhere along the way, my son had decided this room, this life, needed to be handed over. That night, I opened my laptop and began compiling everything: emails, documents, meeting records, notes from conversations. I wasn't emotional about it. I was thorough. By midnight, the pattern was undeniable. The requests, the inquiries, the quiet positioning, the consistent omission of my voice. And then I found the message that changed everything. It was buried in a forwarded email chain. One Lila had flagged but not fully read. I opened it now, scanning quickly until a single sentence made my breath catch. "Once she's formally sidelined, the transition will be clean." Clean. The email wasn't written by my son, but it was sent to him. He had been copied intentionally, and he had replied, "Agreed. Timing matters." I stared at the screen, the words blurring slightly. There it was, the confirmation I hadn't wanted but needed. This wasn't improvisation. This was orchestration. When Lila came by the next morning, I showed her the email. She read it once, then again, her jaw tightening. "That's it," she said quietly. "That's your proof." "Yes," I replied. "And it's enough." She looked at me, searching my face. "What are you thinking?" I closed the laptop carefully. "I'm thinking that he believes this ends with him stepping into my place. And he's mistaken." And with pencil, the evidence didn't make me feel betrayed anymore. It made me feel focused, because once the truth is this clear, there's no room left for doubt or negotiation. My son had assumed that illness meant weakness, that recovery meant delay, that silence meant surrender. What he hadn't accounted for was the fact that I had spent my entire career understanding systems, anticipating moves, and knowing when to act quietly. This wasn't a confrontation to be handled emotionally. This was a structure to be dismantled. That afternoon, I made one phone call. Not to my son, not to the city, not to the bank. I called an attorney I trusted, someone who understood governance, authority, and timing. When she answered, I said only this: "I need to secure my position before someone else finishes planning my exit." She didn't ask why. She simply said, "Come in tomorrow." I hung up and looked around the room one last time. For years, I had told myself that power came from presence, from showing up constantly, from never stepping away. Now I understood something far more important. Power comes from knowing exactly when to step back and how to return. And when I did, everything my son thought he understood about control was about to collapse. That night, after I hung up with the attorney, I didn't turn on the television or pick up a book. I didn't call anyone. I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, as if seeing it for the first time, the living room where I had taken countless calls. The dining table, where zoning maps had been spread out beside half-finished dinners. The study where decisions had been weighed, reconsidered, and finalized. Every room carried evidence of a life built carefully, thoughtfully, over decades. I realized then how much of that life I had allowed to be reframed by someone else. I sat in the study and opened the notebook again. The sentence I had written stared back at me. I will decide what happens next. For years, I had reacted to deadlines, to requests, to my son's needs, his ambitions, his interpretations of what was best. Even my illness had been something I responded to, something that happened to me rather than something I claimed. That was the last time I would let events dictate my role. I thought about calling my son, confronting him with the email, the bank inquiry, the memo. The temptation was there, sharp and immediate. I imagined the look on his face, the scramble for explanations, the defensive anger. It would have felt satisfying, briefly, but satisfaction wasn't what I needed. I needed certainty. I slept that night more deeply than I had since before the collapse. When I woke, my chest felt steady, my thoughts clear. The decision I had been circling was already made. The next morning, I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel like myself rather than someone recovering. I drove slowly but confidently to the attorney's office, the familiar streets grounding me. The building was modest, unremarkable, which I appreciated. No grand statements, just competence. The attorney, Margaret Collins, greeted me without fuss. She had known me professionally for years, advised on contracts, reviewed frameworks, always precise. "You look well," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "I am," I replied, "and I intend to stay that way." She listened as I laid everything out, the missed calls, the documents, the inquiries, the email. I spoke calmly, without accusation or emotion. Facts only, patterns, timelines. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and folded her hands. "This isn't uncommon," she said. "It's just usually less organized." "That's what concerns me," I replied. She nodded. "You're right to act now, not defensively, structurally." That word again, structurally. We spent the next 2 hours mapping options. Not hypotheticals, not emotional gestures, concrete moves, formal reaffirmation of my authority, clear documentation of decision-making boundaries, legal notices limiting proxy actions, financial safeguards, a plan that didn't accuse, didn't confront, but made one thing unmistakable. I was not absent. By the time I left her office, I felt something settle into place. Not relief, not triumph, alignment. On the drive home, my phone rang. My son, I let it go to voicemail. When I got home, there was a message waiting. Short, controlled. "We need to talk. Urgently." I didn't respond. Instead, I spent the afternoon organizing my files, both digital and physical. I removed outdated access, changed passwords, updated contact lists. Each action was small, but together they formed a quiet wall. Lila came by in the early evening. She noticed immediately. "You look different," she said. "I feel different," I replied. I told her what I'd done. Not everything, but enough. She listened, then smiled slightly. "You're not reacting anymore." "No," I said. "I'm moving." That night, I sat alone again, but the silence felt earned rather than imposed. I thought about the version of myself my son seemed to believe in. The aging official, slowing down, becoming unreliable. A figure to be managed. He had mistaken patience for weakness, distance for surrender. The next day, the formal notices began going out. Carefully worded, professional, unremarkable on the surface. To the city, to the bank, to relevant committees. Each one reaffirmed my role, my authority, my continued involvement. There was no announcement, no spectacle, just reality, quietly reasserted. By midweek, the response came. My son showed up at the house unannounced. I watched him through the window as he paced the porch. Phone pressed to his ear. He rang the bell twice. When I opened the door, he looked unsettled for the first time since my collapse. "What did you do?" he asked. I stepped aside to let him in. I clarified things. He followed me into the living room. Agitation clear now. People are calling me, asking questions, saying they need confirmation before proceeding. "That's appropriate," I said. "They should." "You're undermining me," he snapped. I met his gaze evenly. "You were never supposed to be standing where you are." His face flushed. "I was protecting you." "No," I said. "You were replacing me." Silence stretched between us. He looked around the room, as if searching for an ally that wasn't there. "This didn't have to be this way," he said finally. "I agree," I replied. "But it is." "I know." He left shortly after, frustrated, confused, already recalculating. I watched his car disappear down the street without regret. That evening, I returned to the notebook and wrote another line beneath the first. "Silence is not surrender." Because the most important decision I had made wasn't about authority or documents or strategy. It was the decision to stop explaining myself to someone who had already decided I was expendable, and from that point forward, everything would proceed on my terms. By the end of that week, the ground beneath my son's certainty had begun to shift, even if he refused to admit it yet. The calls he had once made with confidence were now being returned with questions. Requests that used to be approved automatically were paused, not denied, just slowed. And in systems like ours, slowing things down was often more powerful than stopping them outright. Margaret called me Friday morning. "The acknowledgements are coming in," she said. "Everything is filed, logged, and time-stamped." "Good," I replied. "There's one more step," she continued. "If you want this to hold, it needs to be visible in the right way." I knew what she meant. Authority that existed only on paper could still be challenged in practice. Visibility mattered, not performance, but presence. "I'll handle that," I said. That afternoon, I sent a single email to the Planning Commission. Brief, professional, calm. I thanked them for their patience during my medical leave. I confirmed my return to active duty, effective immediately. I attached a revised agenda for the upcoming meeting, signed by me. No explanations, no justifications. Within minutes, replies began to come in. Polite acknowledgments, relief, thinly veiled. A few subtle notes of apology for moving forward without my input. I responded to none of them. There was no need. My son called again that evening. I let it ring. He showed up the next day instead. This time, he didn't bring documents. He brought urgency. He stood in my doorway, jaw tight, eyes sharp. "You blindsided me," he said. I gestured for him to sit. He didn't. "I restored order," I replied. "You went around me." "There was no around," I said evenly. "You inserted yourself where you didn't belong." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "You're making this adversarial. I'm making it accurate." Est. He paced the room, frustration spilling over now. "Do you have any idea how this looks? People think I overstepped." "Did you?" He stopped pacing and looked at me. For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered across his face, then it hardened again. "I did what had to be done," he said. "You were out of commission." "I was ill," I corrected. "There's a difference," he scoffed. "In the real world, there isn't." "Do I?" I studied him then, really studied him, and saw not a son concerned for his mother, but a man irritated that his timeline had been disrupted. "You assumed my absence was permanent," I said. "You assumed my silence was consent." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. The truth sat there between us, undeniable. "This isn't finished," he said finally. "No," I agreed. "It isn't." After he left, I felt no rush of triumph. What I felt instead was resolve deepening into something firmer, because this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about ensuring there would be no more attempts to quietly rewrite my role. Margaret and I met again early the following week. This time, The conversation turned from reinforcement to insulation. "We should assume he'll push back," she said. "Not emotionally. Procedurally." "I agree," I replied. We discussed contingencies, escalation paths, formal notices that could be triggered if lines were crossed again. Not as threats, but as safeguards. "And there's one more thing," she added, sliding a document across the table. "Given the nature of what you've uncovered, it may be wise to make your intentions unmistakable." I read the document carefully. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't accuse anyone. It simply clarified succession protocols and explicitly excluded interim claims without direct authorization from me. It closed a door my son had assumed was already open. I signed it without hesitation. That afternoon, Lila and I took a walk around the neighborhood. My stamina was improving, but I kept the pace slow. The trees were beginning to turn, leaves scattered across the sidewalk. "You're very calm," she said after a while. "I am," I replied. "That surprises me too." "Why do you think that is?" I considered the question. "Because I'm no longer hoping he'll understand. I'm acting as if he won't." "I weigh." She nodded. "That's clarity." Later that evening, I received an email from the city manager. Short, direct. "Your reaffirmation has been noted. We'll proceed accordingly." I forwarded it to Margaret, then closed my laptop. The next morning, my son sent a message. Not a call, a message. "We need to reset this dynamic. Let's meet with a mediator." I read it once, then again. The request came too late, framed too carefully. I replied with one sentence. "There is no dynamic to reset. There is only structure to respect." The response did not come. Over the following days, I watched as the pressure he had applied quietly dissipated, not because I confronted him publicly, but because the channels he relied on no longer bent in his favor. His influence diminished not through exposure, but through irrelevance. And that was the lesson I knew he would struggle to accept. Power doesn't disappear when it's challenged properly. It simply returns to its rightful place. By the end of the week, the final safeguard was in place. Margaret called to confirm. "You're protected," she said, comprehensively. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat at my desk, the late afternoon light stretching across the room, and allowed myself a moment of stillness. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was correction. And whatever my son thought he was preparing for, he was about to learn something I had spent a lifetime understanding. Authority does not belong to the impatient. It belongs to those who know when to move and when to wait. The formal confrontation came sooner than I expected, though in hindsight it was inevitable. Once the structures were in place and the channels clarified, there was only one move left for my son to make. He couldn't maneuver quietly anymore. He had to come to me directly. He called on a Tuesday morning, his voice clipped, controlled. "I've scheduled a meeting," he said, "with the city manager and council. You should be there." "I will be," I replied. The meeting was set for Thursday afternoon at City Hall, in the same building where I had spent so much of my life working. I arrived early, not because I was anxious, but because I wanted a moment alone in that space. The hallway smelled faintly of old paper and cleaning solution. The floors gleamed, polished by years of foot traffic. Familiar. When I entered the conference room, the city manager greeted me with a careful smile. Margaret sat beside me, composed as always. My son arrived last, carrying a leather portfolio, his expression tight. We took our seats. There was no small talk. He began immediately. "This situation has become unnecessarily complicated," he said, directing his words at the city manager but glancing at me. "My intention has always been to ensure continuity." "And mine," I said calmly, "has been to maintain integrity." He exhaled sharply. "You were unavailable. Decisions had to be made." "You decided that," I replied. Without consulting me, he opened his portfolio and slid several documents across the table. "We're prepared to formalize an interim arrangement, temporarily, until you're fully recovered." Margaret didn't touch the papers. Neither did I. "There is no interim," I said. "I am fully capable. That has been documented." He leaned forward, frustration creeping into his voice. You're being stubborn. This isn't about pride. It's about practicality. The city manager shifted uncomfortably. Margaret spoke before I could respond. Mrs. Harris's capacity has been independently evaluated, she said evenly. Any attempt to impose interim authority without her consent would be inappropriate. My son turned to her, irritation flashing across his face. With respect, this is a family matter. No, I said. It's a governance matter. Silence settled over the table. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the quick assessment of who held leverage now. He changed tactics. Mom, he said, softening his tone. I was worried. You scared us. Did I? I asked. He hesitated. You collapsed. People talk. They talked because you told them to, I replied. He looked away, jaw tightening. I reached into my folder and placed a single document on the table. The email chain, the one sentence highlighted. Once she's formally sidelined, the transition will be clean. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain. I simply let the paper sit there. The city manager read it slowly. Margaret watched my son. He swallowed. That was taken out of context. What context makes that acceptable? I asked. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since this began, he had no prepared response. You assumed my illness made me weak, I continued. You assumed my silence meant surrender. And you assumed no one would show me what you were doing. That's not fair, he snapped. Fair has nothing to do with it, I said. Accuracy does. Margaret slid another document across the table. Given the evidence, she said, Mrs. Harris has every right to protect her role and her assets. Any further attempts to undermine that could have serious consequences. The city manager cleared his throat. I think it's clear where authority rests. My son leaned back in his chair. His confidence finally cracked. So that's it? He asked me. You're cutting me out? I'm correcting you, I said. There's a difference. I nut. He laughed bitterly. After everything I've done for you. You mean after everything you decided for me, I replied. The meeting ended shortly after that. There was nothing left to discuss. The documents were gathered, the positions clarified, the outcome settled. As we stood to leave, my son looked at me one last time. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. You can't do this alone. I met his gaze. I already have. Outside, the late afternoon sun warmed the steps of City Hall. Margaret walked beside me as we descended. You handled that well, she said. I handled it honestly, I replied. That evening, at home, I sat in the study and let the events replay in my mind, not with regret, but with clarity. The confrontation had not changed my son. It had revealed him fully, and that was enough. I knew then that the final step was still ahead. Not another meeting, not another document, but a decision that would reshape the future in a way he had not anticipated. He had planned for succession. He had not planned for consequence. And when it arrived, it would be quiet, irreversible, and entirely of his own making. The consequence did not come in the form my son expected. There was no dramatic announcement, no public accusation, no emotional reckoning that could be spun into a story of misunderstanding and reconciliation. What came instead was quieter, and because of that, far more permanent. 2 days after the meeting at City Hall, I received a call from Margaret. Her voice was measured, but there was an edge of satisfaction she didn't bother to hide. The ethics review has been initiated, she said. Not by us. I closed my eyes briefly. By whom? The city manager, she replied. He reviewed the materials after your meeting. The email, the access attempts, the representations made on your behalf without authorization. He has obligations he can't ignore. I felt no surge of triumph, only inevitability. What does that mean? It means your son's firm is now under formal review for conflict of interest and misrepresentation, she said. And until that's resolved, he's barred from advising on any matters connected to your department. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat very still, listening to the quiet of the house. This was the part my son had never accounted for. He had assumed that consequences, if they came at all, would be personal, emotional, contained within the family. He had not considered that by stepping into my professional space, by speaking for me, by manipulating systems I understood better than he did, he had exposed himself to scrutiny he could not control. That afternoon, Lila stopped by. She could tell something had shifted the moment she saw me. "It happened," she said. "Yes," I replied. "But not the way he thought," I explained. She listened, her expression serious. "He'll be furious," she said. "I know. Do you regret it?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. "No," I said. "I regret that he put himself in this position. But I don't regret refusing to protect him from the consequences of his own choices." The fallout was swift but contained. His firm issued a statement emphasizing cooperation and transparency. Meetings were postponed. Calls went unanswered. For the first time since I could remember, my son was the one waiting. He called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail. The next morning, he showed up again, unannounced. He looked different, less composed. The confidence he wore so easily had been replaced by something sharper, more desperate. "You didn't have to do this," he said the moment I opened the door. "I didn't," I replied. "I didn't initiate anything." "You knew this would happen," he accused. "I knew it could," I said, "because actions have consequences beyond intention." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing my living room like a stranger. "They're treating me like I crossed a line." "You did," I said. "I was trying to help you," he insisted. "You're acting like I betrayed you." I watched him carefully. "You weren't helping me," I said. "You were helping yourself to my authority." "That's not fair." "No," I agreed. "It's accurate." He stopped pacing and looked at me, really looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time. "So that's it," he said quietly. "You're choosing this over me." I shook my head. "I'm choosing myself over being erased." Silence stretched between us, heavy and unresolved. "You always taught me to think ahead," he said finally. "To anticipate outcomes." "Yes," I replied. "And I also taught you that integrity matters." He let out a bitter laugh. "Integrity doesn't pay the bills." "No," I said, "but it determines whether you deserve what you earn." He left without another word. In the days that followed, I watched from a distance as the situation unfolded. I didn't comment. I didn't intervene. I didn't shield him. That was the hardest part, harder even than the confrontation, because for the first time, I was not managing the consequences of his choices for him. The review concluded weeks later. No criminal findings, no dramatic penalties, but the damage was done. His credibility took a hit. Contracts quietly moved elsewhere. Invitations stopped coming. And something else happened. Something smaller but more telling. People began calling me again, not out of obligation, out of respect. Colleagues who had hesitated before now sought my input directly. Decisions that had been rushed were revisited. My presence, once assumed to be fading, was reestablished without question. One afternoon, as I sat in my study reviewing documents, I realized something that surprised me. I no longer felt the urge to explain myself. The final twist wasn't that I removed my son from my life, or stripped him of inheritance, or publicly shamed him. It was that I stopped cushioning him from reality. I allowed the world to respond to him exactly as he had presented himself. And in doing so, I reclaimed something far more valuable than control or vindication. I reclaimed authorship over my own life. The last time my son called, weeks later, his voice was quieter, less certain. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said. "I know," I replied. There was a long pause. "What happens now?" I looked out the window at the street, at the steady movement of a world that did not revolve around either of us. "Now," I said, "we live with the choices we made." And for the first time, I knew exactly which ones were mine. 3 months have passed since the meeting at City Hall, since the phone calls slowed. since the quiet consequences settled into place. My recovery has been steady. The doctors are pleased. My heart is stronger than it was before the collapse. Not because nothing happened, but because something finally did. My days look different now, not smaller, more deliberate. I wake early, not out of habit, but because I want to. I make coffee and sit by the window while the street comes alive. I no longer check my phone first thing in the morning. If someone needs me, they will reach me directly, not through assumptions or intermediaries. At work, my role is clearer than it has ever been. There is no confusion about authority now. No one speaks for me. No one steps in unless I ask. The meetings are quieter, more focused. The urgency that once drove everything has softened into something more sustainable. People listen again, not because I demanded it, but because I stopped apologizing for taking up space. Lila still comes by often. Sometimes we talk. Sometimes we sit in comfortable silence. She has returned to her own work with renewed confidence, and I see in her the same steadiness I once tried to give my son. The difference is that she never mistook guidance for permission to erase. One afternoon, as we walked through the park near my house, she asked me a question I hadn't yet asked myself. "Do you miss him?" she said. I didn't answer right away. "I miss who I thought he was," I said finally, "and who I thought I needed to be for him." She nodded, understanding. My son and I speak rarely now. When we do, the conversations are brief, careful. He no longer asks for access, advice, or approval. He doesn't update me on his work unless I ask. There is a distance between us that wasn't chosen in anger, but in clarity. I don't know if it will close. I don't know if it should. What I do know is that I no longer bend myself to keep the peace. I no longer mistake silence for kindness or sacrifice for love. The absence of constant contact has given me something unexpected: peace. I think often about the moment I collapsed on the floor of that hearing room, the way the ceiling lights blurred, the sound of my name called from far away. At the time, it felt like my body had betrayed me. Now I understand it differently. My body stopped me because I hadn't stopped myself. For years, I believed that power came from endurance, from being needed, from never stepping away. I believed that if I kept showing up, kept smoothing things over, kept putting others first, everything would hold together. What I didn't understand was that endurance without boundaries becomes erasure. The truth is, I didn't lose my son because I stood up for myself. I lost the version of our relationship that depended on my silence, and that version was already costing me more than I could afford. There are moments when grief still surprises me. A thought, a memory, the sound of his voice from years ago, before ambition hardened into entitlement. I allow myself those moments without judgment. Loss doesn't always arrive with an ending. Sometimes it settles quietly and stays, but it no longer defines me. Instead, I find myself looking forward, planning trips I used to postpone, saying no without explanation, saying yes without guilt. I volunteer now, mentoring young professionals who remind me of why I chose public service in the first place. I tell them the truth I learned too late. You can be generous without disappearing. You can love without surrendering your authority. And you can set boundaries without becoming cruel. People often talk about betrayal as something explosive, loud, obvious. But the most dangerous betrayals are quiet. They wear the language of concern. They arrive disguised as help. And they rely on your willingness to doubt yourself. If there is one thing I have learned, it is this. When someone shows you who they are when they think you are weak, believe them. And when you realize the life you built is being quietly rearranged without your consent, do not rush to confront. Do not plead to be included. Step back, look carefully, and then decide. I am still a mother. That will never change. But I am no longer a role to be managed, a position to be inherited, or a voice to be replaced. I am a person with agency, history, and a future that belongs to me. The collapse I feared would end everything turned out to be the moment I reclaimed it. And if my story reaches you at a moment when you are questioning your own worth, your own authority, your right to take up space, let me say this clearly. It is not too late. not to speak, not to choose, not to stop shrinking. The moment you stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from your silence is the moment your life begins to realign. Mine did. And I am finally standing where I belong,